Hello, it's Jennifer from Sea Lemon. I have received a lot of messages from you guys asking if I have tried this We Are Memory Keepers bookbinding guide, so today we're going to test it out. I'll share my first impressions, show you how to use it, and test out a couple of binding methods with it. I'll put a link to this guide and all of the supplies I used in the description below, along with any bookbinding tutorials that I show you along the way. Before we get into it, I'm happy to say that today's video is sponsored by Audible. They have so many audiobooks to choose from, and it's always fun to listen to a good story while you work on your project. Audible also makes their own originals, which include exclusive audio titles created by a diverse group of celebrated storytellers. If you want to try it out, you can get your first audiobook for free plus 2 Audible originals when you try Audible for 30 days. Just go to audible.com/sealemon or text sealemon to 500-500. Here is the packaged We Are Memory Keepers bookbinding guide, coming in around $19 from Amazon. I've also seen this for sale at Michael's, and you could use one of their coupons to get it around the same price. It's a 6-piece set, and it says it includes everything you need to make these bound books, but obviously it doesn't include everything you need. It's good to know that it can pierce through 8 sheets of paper, bookboard, or leather, and it can create books up to 9 inches tall, books like these. Let's get into the felt pouch with a snap closure. It comes with your awl, a curved binding needle, and a straight binding needle, and binding thread, which I think is a linen coated in something. It's not beeswax, but it is some kind of coated, strong binding thread. Alright, let's see what books it recommends to make with this guide, starting with saddle stitch. Fun fact, you can store the needles on this felt pouch like a pincushion so they don't get lost. The guide has 2 sides. This side goes inward like a book cradle, and the other is totally flat. And rubber feet so it stays in place on your tabletop while you work on your project. The top part is the guide, and it has 2 sides to it, and you'll know which side it goes onto because it snaps into place on the base. The cradle side is primarily for piercing signatures. Let's test this one with 4 sheets, and I'm putting the guide on top so you can see that it fits snug into place, and then you have to put those little screws on either side. I aligned my open signature up to the left edge, and you can see my sheets are letter size 8.5 inches, so there's a little bit more space because it fits 9 inches. I'm piercing through the middle circled holes just to start with, and using the awl that it came with. It really wasn't too hard to pierce through 4 sheets. It felt really easy actually, and then all I had to do is unscrew the guide, and here is my pierced signature. These holes are about 1/2 inch apart, and remember, you can pierce through more than 4 sheets, up to 8 to make a saddle stitch book. This is minor, but it does leave over some paper on the holes since you are piercing through a template. When it comes to signatures for a book, I like to pierce the holes further apart, so that's what I'm going to try on this one. I start from the middle so I can measure out evenly from both sides, and at this point I got a little bit of confusion because I forgot which hole I pierced, so I feel like it would be easier if I had a paint pen to mark the holes that I usually pierce through. So it's easy to use the guide that they already have printed on for you, but if you want to make your own measurements, I recommend marking them in some way to save time. Overall, pretty easy to pierce through signatures, and if you want to saddle stitch these, I have a tutorial. It's old school, so old school Sea Lemon. You can check it out up here. I will also link it down below. Saddle stitch is a very easy binding method, and you can follow these instructions to learn how to do it. I also think my recent chain stitch tutorial would work well for the holes that were about 1/2 inch apart, so you can try this one out if you want something different than a saddle stitch. Next, let's try a board and pages for a Coptic stitch. For the cover, you would want to use the other side of the base and the other side of the guide, and I found it easier to align it in the middle of the outside holes, if that makes sense. I felt like this spacing worked better for it. For Coptic stitch, I like to make the holes on the outer edges of the book, and I'll tell you why in this video in the card up here, but obviously you can make the holes any measurement apart, it's really up to you. This board is about 2 millimeters thick, and it was pretty easy to pierce through. I think because there's a hole below it, it's easier to get the awl through it without putting any real force in it. So if you ever have pain in your hand when you use an awl, this tool could be an easier option to alleviate that. So if we're doing Coptic Stitch, now I need to pierce the signatures in the same measurements as the cover. Just like I did with the saddle stitch pages, I'm using the cradle side this time, and using my cover as a guide so I know which holes to pierce. Now, since this can handle up to 8 pages, you can actually double your signatures and pierce through multiple at a time. I'm going to try that with these two to see how much harder it is to pierce through. And it actually wasn't that much more difficult than the cover, which was pretty easy. So I honestly think this could pierce through more than 8 sheets, but it could also depend on the thickness of your paper. After you pierced all your holes, the next step would be to bind your book with the Coptic Stitch, and they do have instructions in the manual for that, but honestly, the pictures were a little bit confusing. There were very little written instructions, so you had to rely on the pictures, and I just think it's much easier if you find a tutorial on YouTube, and I do have one, so you can check out my Coptic Stitch tutorial right here. This is also an old school Sea Lemon tutorial, but it still works and you can follow the instructions step by step. It's easy to follow. I will also link this in the description. Now let's try the third recommended use for this guide, a Japanese bound template. Their pamphlet does have 5 different methods to try, and they do show you where to pierce through the holes on the guide. I'm going to start with the most simple one, which is the 4-hole method. I'm going to try it on 12 sheets this time, and I'm going to use this previous book I made for reference. Something else to point out, the row of holes on the flat side only go out to about 3/4 of an inch, and my binding is 1 inch out. It's not a big deal, I can still work with it, but it's just something to note. I lined my 12 sheets on the flat side centered within the guide because I found the measurements work a little bit better for me, but you can also put it flush to the left. I pierced 4 holes and it easily went through 12 sheets, so I don't know how much more it can go through. If you've tried this guide and you know its limit, please let me know in the comments. This one I'm actually going to try out the thread that it came with, and I will be doing a Japanese 4-hole method, which I also have a tutorial for. You can check that out right here. The guide's pamphlet did have some instructions for this 4-hole method, but again, honestly, it was a little bit hard to follow, and I think it's way easier to learn from a video, so if you want to check this out, I'll put it in the description below. I have to admit, it's been so long since I made this that I actually had to go back on my own tutorial to learn how to do it. And I'm using the guide's straight needle, and I actually like this because it has a blunt end, so I don't stab my fingers every time I bind. But the binding thread, I'm not so sure about. It reminds me of dental floss, so it has a flat shape, which lays a little bit wonky, and it's not my favorite, but again, that could be like a personal preference. It didn't fray and it holds the book together, so it does the job. Now I'm going to try a binding that wasn't advertised with this guide. It has no mention in the pamphlet about it, but I felt like the guide could actually work for it, and that's a long stitch. This is going to be a smaller book with 3 signatures and a piece of green vinyl which will wrap around the signatures. It does say this guide can pierce through leather, and vinyl is very similar, so it should have no problem. I centered the guide on the cover, screwed it in, and pierced through these rows on the flat side of the guide. Just as expected, it pierced through very easily, and if I didn't have this guide, how I normally would do it is I would make a template and then put that template on the vinyl and then pierce through it with an awl and a cutting mat, but I honestly think this tool made the process easier. Now for the signatures, I'm using the cradle side, and since I know it can pierce through 12 sheets, I stacked all of them together, screwed it in, and I pierced through all 12 sheets in the same measurements as I did with the cover. And this time to bind, I'm going to try out the curved needle that came with the kit and the same binding thread. Again, I'm using the long stitch binding method for this book, and guess what? I also have a tutorial for it. And much like my other tutorials, it is also easy to follow. You can find the link to this video in the description below. I did do it a while ago, and you don't have to double up your thread like I showed in this video, but it is an option. And once you learn how to do it, it's actually a pretty easy binding method to do. Here is how my final long stitch book turned out. The curved needle was pretty easy to use. It was like a standard curved binding needle, but I found the process went a lot quicker when I didn't have to mark out individually all the holes to pierce through. Instead, I could just pierce through the guide that already has holes laid out. If you try this tool, I highly recommend experimenting, adjust the sizes, the pages, the measurements to really see what this guide can do for your project. I'd like to thank Audible for sponsoring this video. You can get your first audiobook for free plus 2 Audible originals when you try Audible for 30 days. Just go to audible.com/clemon or text clemon to 500-500. Ultimately, I feel like this is a good guide for beginners or any level. I especially like it for stab bindings or long stitch bindings. It makes a quick template so you don't have to spend so much time marking the holes, and it makes a quick clamp for easy alignment. Sometimes I found the holes weren't quite aligned to where I wanted them to be. That could just be a personal preference. And sometimes it was hard to see through the guide which holes I already pierced. I think this would make a nice gift for anybody interested in bookbinding. However, I found the instructions were a little bit difficult to follow, especially if you're not familiar with how to bind. So if you tried this, I recommend searching some tutorials on YouTube rather than following the little pamphlet that it comes with. It's also worth noting that there are similar guides out there. They're usually under a different name like Cradle or Binding Cradle or Punch Tool, and I'll link some down below in the description if you're interested. I haven't seen any with 2 sides like this, so this was a really interesting tool to try out. And if there is something else you want me to try out on this channel, leave it in a comment below. Shout out to my patrons and YouTube members. Thank you for supporting this channel. And if you're interested in helping me make more content to put out there for you to watch, go check out the links down below. And if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button and hit the bell right next to it and sign up for post notifications. Otherwise, you might not know if I post a video. That's just how YouTube does it. So if you hit the bell, sign up for those notifications. It's much appreciated. And if you want to jump into more supply testing review type videos, I'll put those. There's a whole playlist right here. Check them out. And all of these links will be down below. And I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!